On the evening of July 23, 2026, President Trump posted something on Truth Social that I do not think most viewers fully understood the size of. He wrote that from this point forth, any and all damages done to ship's cargo or anything related thereto will be paid for by Iranian money that the United States has in its possession and controls. He called it fair and equitable. He did not specify how much money. He did not specify which frozen accounts. He did not cite any legal authority. He simply announced that Iran's own frozen billions will now be spent covering the cost of a war that Iran is still actively fighting against the country holding that money. Within hours, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi responded on social media with a sentence I want you to sit with for a moment. He wrote that seizing another nation's assets to pay for unrelated future claims is an incendiary precedent, and that once governments normalize confiscation, no one's assets are safe. Every major outlet covered this as an Iran story. A story about punishment. A story about making Tehran pay for its own aggression. I want to argue today that this is not primarily an Iran story at all. I think what Trump announced on July 23rd may turn out to be one of the most consequential moments for the global financial system in this entire war. And I want to show you exactly why by walking you through something that already happened once before with a different country entirely. Let me introduce the framework I am using today, because I think it captures exactly what is happening here. I call it the confiscation boomerang. Here is the core idea. When a dominant financial power seizes the reserve assets of a country it is fighting, it does not just punish that one adversary. It sends an unmistakable signal to every other government on earth that holds reserves inside that same financial system. The signal is this: your money is not actually yours. It is yours only for as long as the country holding it approves of your behavior. And once that signal goes out, you cannot control who receives it or how they respond to it. The boomerang does not simply hit Iran. It flies outward toward Beijing, toward Moscow, toward Riyadh, toward every central bank on the planet holding dollar-denominated reserves inside Western institutions. And I want to show you today that we have already run this exact experiment once before in recent memory with a different country, and we already know exactly how the world responded. Let me give you the evidence piece by piece, because I think the pattern here is very hard to miss once you see it laid out in order. First, let's look precisely at what Trump actually said and did not say. The statement referenced roughly $2 billion of Iranian cash assets currently under United States control, according to reporting that circulated within hours of the post. But Trump did not specify the legal authority under which frozen sovereign assets could simply be directed to compensate private ship owners and cargo interests for war damages. There is no treaty framework for this. There is no judicial process determining fault or apportioning compensation. There is a social media post from the president declaring by decree that Iranian money will now be spent this way. Compare this to how sanctions and asset freezes have traditionally worked going back decades. Freezing assets has historically been treated as a temporary punitive measure meant to pressure a government back to the negotiating table. Spending that frozen money, outright treating it as already forfeited and redistributable, is a fundamentally different and much more aggressive category of action. Second, look at exactly how Araghchi responded, because the specific language he chose was not accidental. He did not simply call this unfair to Iran. He explicitly framed it as a precedent question aimed at every other government watching. Once governments normalize confiscation, no one's assets are safe. He also added a second and much sharper line, accusing what he called compromised individuals in the US administration of ignoring the realities on the ground and being focused only on 2028. That is a direct reference to the next American presidential election cycle. Araghchi is explicitly arguing that this decision is being driven by short-term domestic political theater rather than by any coherent long-term financial or strategic logic. Whether or not you agree with that characterization, the fact that Iran's own foreign minister is speaking directly past the ship damages issue and directly to the global audience of central bankers and finance ministries tells you Tehran understands exactly which audience actually matters here, and it is not the American public. Third, and this is where the confiscation boomerang framework gets its real evidentiary weight. We have already watched this exact playbook happen once before. In early 2022, the United States and its allies froze approximately $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves following the invasion of Ukraine. At the time, Western officials described this as an unprecedented but justified response to unprovoked aggression. What happened next is now extremely well documented by central banks and financial researchers around the world. Central banks in China, India, Turkey, and numerous other countries dramatically accelerated their purchases of physical gold, specifically because gold cannot be frozen by a foreign government sitting inside a computer system. Global central bank gold buying hit record levels in the years immediately following the Russian reserve freeze. Multiple countries, including Saudi Arabia and the broader BRICS coalition, began actively building payment infrastructure, specifically designed to bypass the dollar-denominated system entirely for exactly the kind of transactions that had previously relied on Western-controlled financial rails. The Russian reserve freeze did not simply punish Russia. It taught the entire non-Western financial world a lesson about where the actual power sits inside the international monetary system, and a huge number of governments responded by quietly reducing their own exposure to that power. Trump's decision to do the same thing to Iran just 3 years later is not a new experiment. It is a second data point confirming the first one for anyone who was still unsure whether the Russian episode was a one-time exception or the new normal. Fourth, look at what is happening inside Washington itself at the exact same moment this announcement was made. The U.S. House of Representatives voted to halt the Iran war absent congressional approval. A similar measure failed narrowly in the Senate. While neither vote could actually force an end to the conflict on its own, the House vote specifically highlights genuine and growing discontent among some Republicans over how Trump has been using his war powers authority throughout this entire conflict. You now have a president making unilateral financial decrees about seized foreign assets at the exact same moment his own party's chamber of Congress is publicly pushing back against the scope of his war-making authority. That is not a sign of a unified, confident wartime government. That is a sign of a government whose own internal checks are actively straining under the pressure of a war that has now stretched on for months longer than most officials originally projected. Fifth, look at the economic spillover happening simultaneously in a completely different body of water. Just as this announcement broke oil prices crossed $100 a barrel for the first time since May, after Houthi rebels in Yemen targeted Saudi-flagged ships in the Red Sea. This is critical context because it means the Strait of Hormuz is no longer the only choke point under active threat. The Red Sea route that shippers have been trying to use as a partial workaround is now becoming dangerous as well. Every alternative option for global energy markets is being closed off nearly simultaneously, and Trump's asset seizure announcement landed in the middle of that broader panic rather than in a calm and controlled moment. Sixth, let's look at the naval blockade numbers because they tell you something important about why this financial escalation happened right now specifically. According to CENTCOM, the naval blockade against Iran was reimposed roughly 9 days before this announcement after the earlier Memorandum of Understanding collapsed. In that 9-day window, the U.S. redirected 12 commercial vessels and disabled one attempting to enter or leave Iranian ports. Iran has continued striking ships in the strait despite this blockade being active. In other words, The blockade alone was clearly not stopping the attacks on its own, which almost certainly explains why Washington reached for a financial escalation tool rather than simply relying on continued naval interdiction. Seventh, Iran rejected the latest ceasefire proposal that Iraqi Prime Minister Ali al-Zaidi personally carried to Tehran just one day before this asset announcement. Araghchi was explicit about why. Iran is not interested in what he called a temporary deal that fails to resolve the final legal status of the Strait of Hormuz itself. This tells you the core dispute was never really about individual ship attacks or even about the nuclear program in isolation. It has always fundamentally been a dispute over who has the legitimate authority to control passage through the single most important waterway in the global energy system. Every financial and military escalation on both sides is really just leverage being applied around that one unresolved question. Eighth, look at the budget request landing at the Pentagon at almost exactly the same moment. Defense Secretary Hegseth and Joint Chiefs Chairman Kane are seeking a $1.5 trillion total defense budget that specifically includes $70 billion earmarked for the Iran war alone. When you place that number next to the roughly $2 billion in frozen Iranian assets Trump is proposing to redirect toward ship damages, the scale mismatch becomes obvious. The seized Iranian funds cover a tiny fraction of the actual cost the United States is absorbing to fight this war. The financial announcement is not really solving a budget problem. It is solving a messaging problem at a moment when American taxpayers are being asked to fund a $70 billion supplemental request for a conflict that keeps extending past every previous deadline officials have projected. Ninth, I want to add one more dimension that I think most coverage is missing entirely because it explains why Trump chose the specific phrase ship's cargo or anything related thereto rather than a narrower and more legally defensible formulation. That phrase is broad enough to potentially cover an enormous range of future claims well beyond the vessels already struck in the strait. If any commercial entity anywhere in the region can argue their losses are related thereto to the broader conflict, the pool of potential claimants against this frozen fund could expand dramatically over time. This is precisely the kind of open-ended language that makes finance ministries nervous, because it signals that the seized funds are not being treated as a fixed and bounded compensation pool, but as a flexible political tool that can be redirected toward whatever category of claim becomes politically convenient to highlight next. A narrow and bounded, seizure limited to specifically documented ship damages would have sent a very different signal than an open-ended promise covering anything related thereto. 10th, I want to look briefly at how quickly this story moved through conservative media in the United States, because it tells you something about the domestic political calculation behind the announcement. Within hours, screenshots and clips of the Truth Social post were circulating widely across social media accounts sympathetic to the administration, framing it explicitly as Iran will pay, and America wins language that plays extremely well to a domestic audience frustrated by months of mounting war costs without a clear resolution. That messaging value matters because it helps explain why the announcement arrived in the loose and legally unspecified form that it did. A carefully lawyered, formal claims process moving through Treasury channels does not generate the same immediate viral domestic political payoff that a single dramatic social media declaration does. The form of the announcement itself tells you as much about its intended audience as its actual content does. So when you put these 10 pieces of evidence together, the picture that emerges is not simply America finally making Iran pay for its own aggression. It is a financially exhausted war effort reaching for a symbolic and legally improvised gesture at the exact moment. Domestic political cracks are widening in Congress. Oil markets are panicking over a second choke point, And Iran itself is refusing every off-ramp that does not resolve the underlying dispute over Hormuz. And underneath all of that sits a decision that history already tells us has global financial consequences far beyond the immediate conflict. Because we watched almost the identical scenario play out with Russia's reserves just 3 years earlier. Now let me steelman the opposing view because I always try to do this honestly. You could argue that this comparison to Russia is not fair at all. Russia's frozen reserves were held in reserve specifically as leverage for a potential future negotiated settlement over Ukraine. Trump is not proposing to hold Iran's money indefinitely as leverage. He is proposing to spend it directly on quantifiable damages that Iran itself caused through repeated attacks on commercial shipping. Under this reading, the confiscation boomerang framework overstates the parallel because this is closer to an insurance claim being paid out of an aggressor's own assets rather than an open-ended weaponization of the reserve currency system itself. Compensating victims using the assets of the party that caused the damage has precedent in international law going back decades through various war reparations frameworks. This argument has real merit, and I do not want to wave it away. But here is what that argument struggles to explain. If this were genuinely a narrow and legally grounded compensation mechanism, you would expect the announcement to include actual legal citations, actual damage assessments, and an actual claims process. Instead, it arrived as a single unstructured social media post with no specified amount, no specified legal authority, and no specified timeline. The absence of that structure is exactly what makes the confiscation boomerang framework apply here, rather than a cleaner reparations framework. Every other central bank watching this unfold is not evaluating the legal nuance between reparations and reserve weaponization. They are simply watching whether a government's frozen dollar-denominated assets can be unilaterally redirected by presidential decree without formal legal process. That observation alone is enough to trigger the same reserve diversification response we already saw after the Russian freeze, regardless of how legally distinct the Iranian case might actually be under a careful reading. Now let me bring in the player who I think benefits most from exactly this kind of moment. And once again, the answer circles back to China. Beijing has spent the last several years quietly building the exact infrastructure that becomes more attractive every single time an episode like this occurs. China's central bank has been one of the most aggressive gold buyers in the world throughout this period. The cross-border interbank payment system that China has been developing as an alternative to the Western-dominated SWIFT network becomes more valuable to potential users with every demonstration that dollar-denominated reserves can be redirected unilaterally by a foreign government. China does not need to say a single public word about Trump's announcement regarding Iranian assets. It simply needs every finance ministry watching this unfold to draw the same quiet conclusion that Russian and now Iranian officials have already drawn publicly. The infrastructure Beijing has spent years constructing is not valuable because of any ideological argument about American power. It is valuable purely as an insurance policy against exactly this specific kind of financial escalation. And every time that insurance policy becomes more obviously necessary, China's alternative system becomes a little bit more attractive to countries that have so far remained cautiously on the sidelines. Let me give you 4 specific things to watch over the coming weeks, because this is how we test whether the confiscation boomerang framework actually holds up against what happens next. First, watch whether any Gulf state or other major dollar reserve holder makes any public statement referencing this specific Iranian asset seizure in the context of their own reserve management strategy. A direct public comment from a country that is not already at war with the United States would be the clearest possible confirmation that the boomerang effect is being taken seriously well beyond Tehran itself. Second, watch global central bank gold purchasing data over the next reporting quarter and compare it to the quarters immediately following the 2022 Russian reserve freeze. If gold buying accelerates at a similar or faster pace, that is strong evidence the pattern is repeating exactly as the historical precedent suggests it would. Third, watch whether Trump's administration ever actually specifies a legal framework or a formal claims process for the Iranian asset spending, given that the current announcement contains neither. The absence of that structure over the coming weeks will tell you whether this was a genuine policy shift or primarily a rhetorical escalation aimed at domestic audiences frustrated by the war's mounting cost. Fourth, watch the Senate specifically for any additional war powers votes, given that the House has already moved once on this question. If Senate Republicans who narrowly blocked the first measure begin shifting their position in the weeks following this asset seizure announcement, that will tell you the confiscation decision itself became a genuine turning point in how Congress views the broader conduct of this war, rather than simply one more headline in an already long list of escalations. Fifth, watch the phrase anything related thereto specifically in any follow-up statements or formal Treasury guidance that eventually gets published. If subsequent official language narrows that phrase down to a specific and bounded category of documented ship damages that would suggest cooler legal heads inside the administration walked back the broadest interpretation of the original post. If instead the phrase remains deliberately vague or gets expanded further in later statements, that will confirm the open-ended version was intentional rather than accidental, and that the flexible political tool interpretation is the correct one. For your homework this week, I want you to go read the original Bloomberg and CNN reporting on Trump's Truth Social statement in full and pay close attention to exactly how little legal specificity the announcement actually contains. Then go find the research that has been published by financial institutions and central bank researchers tracking global gold purchase and the dollarization trends since the 2022 Russian reserve freeze. Put the two documents side by side and ask yourself honestly whether the pattern we saw then is already visible again in the data we have access to today. So let me leave you with the actual question I think matters most after everything we have covered today. Everyone keeps asking whether seizing Iran's frozen assets will actually punish Tehran enough to change its behavior in the Strait. I think that is the wrong question given everything the historical record already shows us. The right question is this: when a reserve currency superpower demonstrates for a second time in 3 years that any government's frozen assets can be unilaterally redirected without a clear legal process the moment that government becomes an adversary, what happens to the willingness of the rest of the world to keep its savings inside that same system in the first place? Because if the answer is that more and more countries quietly conclude their reserves are not truly theirs until they have moved them somewhere the confiscation cannot reach, then the $2 billion being spent on ship repairs this week may end up being remembered as a rounding error next to the much larger sum of trust that just walked out the door. Empires throughout history have rarely been undone by the enemy standing directly in front of them. They have far more often been undone by the quiet and cumulative decisions of every smaller power watching from the sidelines, deciding one account transfer at a time that the old arrangement is no longer worth the risk. Think about that. I will see you in the next one.